Days of rioting in England and Belfast. Social media has been used by the far right to spread rumors about immigrants and organize protests that have become violent. Thousands of police officers are on alert. So, what's behind the surge in violence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Thousands of police officers are on high alert in the UK after rioting in cities and towns in England and in Belfast. The violence has been blamed by Prime Minister Keir Starmer on far-right activists and groups organizing themselves online. Individuals, rather than organizations, seem to have been driving the protests, almost all focused around migrants. Mosques have also been targeted. Migration has been a leading topic in politics and media in the UK for several decades, with some newspapers and politicians carving out a hardline stance. The last Conservative government had planned to deport illegal migrants to Rwanda, a plan dropped by the new Labour one. So, why has there been such a widespread and sudden upsurge in violence? And how have politics and media affected attitudes on migration? We'll be discussing this with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
Riots by far-right protesters have spread across the UK, sparked by a series of murders in a seaside town in the northwest of England. 3 girls aged 6, 7 and 9 were stabbed to death in a knife attack at a children's dance class in Southport. Police arrested a 17-year-old boy who was born in Britain. But users on social media falsely claimed he was a Muslim asylum seeker. Newly elected Reform MP Nigel Farage was criticised for speculating whether, in his words, the truth was being withheld by authorities. A mosque in Southport was attacked by a far-right mob.
Local communities are being thrown apart, and these people from outside are coming and literally destroying the mosque. And we've spoken to the imam from Southport. He said he had to barrage and lock himself inside the office with his other members who were in the mosque at the time. They were afraid the door was going to be broken down.
In the days that followed, the riots spread. In Hartlepool in the northeast of England, a police car was set alight. And in London, crowds pelted the gates of Downing Street and fought with police officers. That prompted the Prime Minister to hold an emergency meeting with police chiefs.
As far as the far right is concerned, this is coordinated, this is deliberate, this is not a protest that has got out of hand. It is a group of individuals who are absolutely bent on violence.
But despite government warnings, disorder has persisted. In Nottingham, officers were confronted by far-right protesters. In Hull, a crowd demonstrated outside a hotel housing migrants, and disorder broke out in Belfast. Campaigners opposing racism were also out on the streets, saying those spreading hate and misinformation must be stopped.
We fought them in the 30s, we fought them in the 50s, we fought them in the 70s in Britain. We will not allow the right wing to dominate our working class communities, and we will come together every week in every town and bring the message of solidarity to all the people that have come to our communities.
Only a month after being elected, the new Labour government is facing a national crisis, and the Prime Minister and Home Secretary are having to focus on stopping violence across the streets of the United Kingdom. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Joining us from London is Shabna Begum, Chief Executive Officer of the Runnymede Trust, a British race equality and civil rights think tank. In Oxford, Katy Brown is a Postdoctoral Fellow at Maynooth University in Ireland. She focuses her research on mainstream far-right discourse. Also in London, Sohan Dsouza is a computational social scientist interested in the links between disinformation and political extremism. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Shabna, let me start with you today. All of these riots, all of this violence, this has all erupted so quickly. Why has there been such a widespread and relatively sudden upsurge in violence?
Well, I think, as you say, it has been an outbreak of violence, but I think it's unsurprising given the long lineage of anti-immigrant, Islamophobic demonisation that we've seen in our mainstream politics now for years, but particularly intensifying in the last few weeks and months since October 7th with Gaza and what's been happening there, and then with the general election campaign, both during and afterwards. The kind of narratives that we saw being espoused by our mainstream political parties, the trading in insults around Muslim communities has become quite normalised by our mainstream political parties. And so it's unsurprising when you see such a hostile environment created by our politicians that then erupts on our streets in the way it has done over the last few days.
Katy, I saw you reacting quite a bit to what Shabna was saying there. It looked like you wanted to jump in, so please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think I'd just echo what Shabna was saying, really. We've witnessed with the election campaign and actually long predating that with Brexit as well, the normalisation of anti-immigration discourses, not just from the far right, but from those at the heart of the mainstream within the Tory party and the Labour Party as well. At these protests, there's been signs that say, "Stop the boats," and that's a direct quote from the previous Conservative government. And then you've got Labour coming in. Now, they did scrap the Rwanda policy, as you mentioned, but they did that often kind of claiming that it was because the policy was ineffective. They weren't challenging the premise of it or the principle of it. And Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has said that the security of Britain's borders is her top priority as well. So we've seen a continuation of this violent rhetoric from the mainstream, and that's played a key role in emboldening these actors and creating the atmosphere that we're seeing in Britain at the moment.
Shabna, let me ask you to pick up on a point you were making and also a point that Katy was making just now. When it comes to this rhetoric that is demonizing of migrants and migration, when you hear top-tier politicians in the UK saying, "Stop the boats," or talking about invasions going on at the border, first of all, how different is that from what you were hearing from politicians just a decade ago? The fact that this is all being normalized, but also how much does that impact this kind of anti-migration sentiment throughout society?
Yeah, I think you're right to say that there has been a marked shift in our discourse, and that we have seen since in the last 14 years with the previous government a real escalation of that kind of hostile narrative, particularly kind of as it was created through the hostile environment policies. So we've seen a real activation and an escalation of some of those narratives, and that legitimizes that kind of demonization of migrants. But I think it's really important that we also note that it's not the violence that we've seen in the last few days hasn't been just directed toward migrants. It has been directed towards settled Muslim communities. And so it's mosques that have been targeted, people of colour, black and brown, who've been targeted by this violence. So, it's really important that we don't just kind of locate it as part of this anti-immigrant narrative. The anti-immigrant narrative has always been racialised, and we've seen that kind of spill out into the violence and the way that violence has targeted not just migrant communities, not just people seeking asylum in this country, but settled Muslim communities and black people from some of the videos that we've seen circulated on social media. So this is a highly racialized and acts of racist rioting that we're seeing on our streets.
Sohan, to kind of continue with the theme that Shabna was talking about there, misinformation around all this first spread online that the suspect in the murder of these girls was a Muslim immigrant. Then far-right groups falsely claimed the suspect was an asylum seeker. How much of a role has social media played in driving all of this, in fueling these riots, in having an impact when it comes to the violence that we're seeing?
Thank you for having me. It has played a huge role, I think. We can see it from the very beginning when these Potemkin news sites that basically do nothing but put out unverified or mostly unverified information, spread the fake name of this alleged asylum seeker person. And that began spreading around and basically directing what had already been building up for months in terms of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant propaganda towards a specific event, focusing people's furies onto that. That the incentives now are probably worse than ever because of the monetization and the combination of the monetization and the opacity surrounding monetization and surrounding identities and being able to track what's behind what. There are many accounts that are behind this, that are spreading misinformation around this, that were supposedly created a long time ago and then just scrubbed and renamed, and they've been spreading more misinformation around this, and that sort of thing.
Katy, let me ask you, what was the scale, from your vantage point, of the misinformation online? And from your vantage point also, how much has social media driven anti-immigrant sentiment, or fueled these demonstrations thus far?
Well, I think clearly it has played a role. It offers a space for the spreading of disinformation at great levels. It also gives an organizing space for these groups as well. So social media is important. But I think that there's a danger also in overemphasizing the role of social media in this, and detracting attention away from some of the issues that Shabna was raising around the role of politicians, political parties, traditional media as well. They've all played a role in creating this political atmosphere. So I think, yes, we can talk about the role of social media, but I think that we need to look at this in a more rounded fashion, and the kinds of narratives that are being put forward by those who we see on television screens, in the newspapers, and the way that they're talking about these issues as well.
Well, Katy, let me ask you more about that. I mean, how much has the way that migration is discussed in media outlets throughout the government, how much has that changed in recent years?
Well, I mean, again, it's kind of touching on similar points to what Shabna was saying. There has been this escalation around it. And we've seen in the case here, for instance, when they were talking about the perpetrator of the attack, the BBC referred to him as born in Wales to Rwandan parents. Now, what's the purpose of referring to his lineage other than to feed into this kind of othering narrative as well? So we do need to look at the traditional media and political parties, our government as well, and their role.
Shabna, I saw you reacting just now to what Katy was saying. Looked like you wanted to add to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're often led to believe this idea that it's a bottom-up process, that politicians are reacting to kind of legitimate grievances and kind of this idea of populist concerns that are rising naturally and organically. But actually, what we do know is that, exactly as Katy just described, the traditional media, our mainstream politicians, are actively responsible for crafting and mediating the messaging on this. And where they have been on this particular incident, but more broadly, how they have talked about immigration, how they have talked about Muslims, has created the perfect fertile ecosystem for all of this violence to occur. So when politicians turn around and talk about being surprised and shocked at the violence, and incidentally, but really importantly, not being able to call it out for being racist rioting in any terms that I've seen so far, when they're expressing their sadness and their regrets and their tough action through policing on these issues, what they need to be aware of is their role, their responsibility, and their culpability in creating that perfect environment for this violence. And we're talking about levels of violence that we haven't seen on our streets in decades, the kind of violence that my parents would have been exposed to back in the 1960s and the 1970s, but which is now being played out on streets, towns, cities across the UK. And that can't just be put down to misinformation in online spaces. We're talking about the politics that's coming out of the UK Parliament and which is being reported in our traditional and established media.
Sohan, I know that in this discussion we're going beyond just the misinformation that's being put out there on online platforms, but I do want to go back to it for a moment and ask you a couple of questions pertaining to that. First of all, are there concrete steps that can be taken to counteract this kind of misinformation that spreads so quickly? It spreads like wildfire online. And if so, what is it that can be done?
For one thing, more transparency, like preventing accounts from just being scrubbed without any tracing and being reused for propaganda. More tactically, I guess it would be introducing some kind of friction, perhaps in collaboration with like crowdsourcing, fact checking, and just generally making sure that something that is spreading too fast has the brakes pulled on it a little bit, so that people who are interested in the truth can get to it before it starts getting into the monetization cycle of the far right.
So let me also ask you, how organized are the efforts of these far-right extremist groups? I mean, how centralized are they? And if most of this is being fueled online and through social media platforms, how difficult does that make it to track these kinds of groups and to track their activities?
It seems mostly leaderless. It's just kind of every person for themselves. As I said, the incentives are really good for getting people to just put out whatever catches the most eyeballs, gets the most attention. There is some possible evidence of collusion among accounts. There are some accounts that suspiciously retweet each other or repost each other at suspiciously close intervals. So there's some on some level there's some collaboration, but possibly even the same people doing it. But yeah, overall it's mostly leaderless. Yeah.
Katy, let me ask you to examine a different aspect of all this. I mean, has political leadership in the UK been leading, or has it been following a narrative shaped by this anti-immigrant faction that we've seen in politics and media?
Well, I think in all these questions, we have to think about the relative power that people have. So, people in government have the power to shape narratives around these issues. And so when we look at this, often there's this idea that, they're being led by popular sentiment. But actually, they're the ones who have the media access in a number of cases, and we've seen them push anti-immigration politics. So, for instance, there's work by my colleagues Aurelian Mondon and Aaron Winter, and they looked at people's perceptions around the issues that are most important to them in their day-to-day lives. And in day-to-day lives, immigration did not feature highly at all. They were asked the same question on the country level, and that's where immigration featured higher. Now, where do people get these ideas from? If it doesn't affect you in your day-to-day life, then how are you getting this information? And that's where we need to look at political leaders, traditional media, to see their responsibility in normalizing this kind of exclusionary racist politics.
So, Katy, let me ask you then, I mean, what do you think are the steps that could be taken to actually start combating this?
Well, obviously, that's a very tough question, but I mean, I think a starting point is actually putting forward alternative narratives. We've seen that politicians are peddling the same kinds of anti-Muslim, anti-immigration, racist narratives as far-right groups. And you don't beat the far right by becoming them. So we need to see progressive alternatives that deal with the issues that are important to people in their day-to-day lives, like the cost of living crisis, education, health, other issues like that. So not trying to beat the far right on its own terms, but actually putting forward progressive alternatives that help people in their day-to-day lives.
Sohan, I saw you reacting there to what Katy was saying, and it looked like you wanted to jump in and add to the point she was making, so please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. The narrative has, in certain information ecosystems, has definitely shifted in a very destructive way, and I think it's important to also not just look at like how can we, to not look at actually how we can just censor social media. We should look at how we can actually fix the problems that people are facing. Really, improve people's lives and give people a better narrative to look towards. Yeah, I agree.
Shabna, it looked like you also wanted to add to that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd agree with the sentiments expressed there. We've seen a really ugly politics develop over the last few years, which doesn't deal with the real issues that are confronting people in their day-to-day lives. And I think we need to see a real shift in our politics, and we need to see alternative progressive narratives as Katy described them. And I think we need our political leaders to accept their responsibility, that they set the agenda for how these events are operating, how they translate into how people experience things like immigration, things like the economic hardship, that those things are political and economic choices made by politicians. They are by no means the responsibility of immigrants or Muslim communities or people of colour in this country.
Shabna, let me also ask you, you're talking about political leadership taking responsibility. This is obviously a massive challenge for Keir Starmer's new government. I mean, is this Labour government going to be able to handle this any differently? Are you seeing any signs of that?
Well, it absolutely has to. I don't think we have any real choice here. What we're seeing over the last few days can't be allowed to continue. We do need to see political leadership. We need to see some action which goes beyond just mealy-mouthed attempts to talk about criminal disorder and thuggery. We need to name it as racism and racist riots that are happening, and we then need to take the action that protects communities who are exposed to that harm. But we need to move beyond that as well, and we think we need longer-term solutions which address the real rot that's set into our politics, where rather than address the real issues, and the real issues, as Katy talked about, are the ones that affect people on their day-to-day lives. They're the kind of things that need us to think about what does wealth distribution look like in this country? How has austerity impacted communities in this country? That's a conversation that we need to have. But right here and now, we need to really be thinking about how do we stop both the violence that's going on and protect those communities that are exposed to that violence.
Well, Shabna, the steps that you were talking about taking, I mean, do you think there is the political will right now to actually take those steps?
I've got to be honest, I haven't seen very much to indicate that there is that political will, but I think that we have seen communities come together, communities protect each other, communities surround their mosques to try and oppose the far-right groups that have gathered outside of them. So I hope that actually our political leaders are inspired by that and seeing how people and communities can come together to oppose far-right racist ideas, and that communities in the social fabric of our country is actually in danger here, and so that they likewise respond to that.
Katy, how much would you say that media and the way that all this has been reported, has that shaped all of this?
Yeah, I think it has. And we've seen this focus on the idea of criminality, and that brings in the sort of response that you're looking at. So Starmer said about bringing in a new violent disorder unit. So that's kind of dealing with it through the criminal lens rather than focusing on those longer term issues that Shabna was talking about and the way that the political climate has been feeding into this. And we've also seen in the media how these activities have been reported on. And there's often been talk of rival protests where there's almost this equivalence between anti-racist mobilizations and people who are going and vandalizing mosques, attacking people in the street. So we also need to look at the media and the way that they've reported, and the creation of these equivalences that distort the nature of these different groups who are trying to combat the far right as well.
And Katy, let me also ask you about what role you think far-right media has played in all of this and getting these attitudes out there for mainstream discussion in the last few decades. More and more print and TV outlets and online outlets in the UK that are right-wing media outlets. How does that impact all this?
Yeah, I think they have had an impact. And again, with social media, there's a growing profile for far-right media outlets as well. But again, I think our attention can be distracted from the fact that we're seeing this within traditional media as well. You know, a couple of weeks ago, The Guardian had an article with former Prime Minister Tony Blair saying that in order to defeat the far right, you need to curb immigration. And these are the kinds of narratives that are being pushed in traditional media as well. So I think sometimes we can be distracted when we're looking to the far right. We're missing what's directly in front of us as well.
Shabna, we only have a couple of minutes left, but let me just ask you from your perspective right now. I mean, if this isn't dealt with in a constructive way, how concerned are you about where all this is headed?
I'm really concerned even now. I don't think that we're talking about what might come in the days ahead. I think what we're seeing right now, random acts of violence, communities that are under siege, that is hugely concerning. It's something that is a real threat to those communities and has sparked fear amongst communities outside of the cities and towns where it has directly taken place. So I think it's really, really important that we deal with this, as Katy said, both in the immediate term, but the longer term, and really recognise how vulnerable and how fearful people of colour in the UK are feeling right now.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Shabna Begum, Katy Brown, and Sohan Dsouza. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.